China is one of the world's 4 ancient civilizations, alongside Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Egypt. It has a written history dating as far back as the Ming Dynasty. That's around 1600 BC, over 3,000 years ago. Now, as you can imagine, you are not about to get the full rundown of the entire history of China. It's simply too immense for the overall story we're about to get into. The story I want to tell has been termed by many scholars as the Century of Humiliation, dating from 1839 until 1949. During this period, China, or better called the Ming Dynasty, and later the Republic of China, faced terrible and humiliating subjugation by Western powers and the former Empire of Japan. The story we're going to begin today is one of pain and hardship, but it is also a tale of endurance and resilience that created the very China we see today. This is the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I myself, I'm quite new to the vast history of China. As for some of you listeners who might already know, I am the writer and narrator of the Pacific War podcast Week by Week. I specialize in the Pacific War, and Japanese history for that matter. And when I ventured into a journey to explain everything that is the Pacific War of 1937 to 1945, when I began my personal channel called the Pacific War Channel over on YouTube, well, I sat down and I began writing about the history of Tokugawa Japan and how Japan would find itself on a path towards virtual oblivion. And I thought to myself, well, what about China? This is when I fell down a rabbit hole that is 19th century China. I immediately fell in love with it. I am a Westerner, a Canadian, and this was knowledge not usually told on my side of the world. So I thought, what are the most important events that made the China we see emerging during the Pacific War, or to be more accurate, the Second Sino-Japanese War? So, on my personal YouTube channel, I began with the First Opium War. By the time I read a few books on that subject, well, I ran into, obviously, the Second Opium War, then the Taiping Rebellion, the Yan'an Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, and the list really goes on. 19th century China is one of the most fascinating, albeit traumatic, episodes of human history, and has everything to do with the formation of the China that we see today. The term "a century of humiliation," or 100 years of humiliation, is how many Chinese historians describe the time period between the First Opium War and the end of the Chinese Civil War. I do not speak the language, nor do I have a full understanding of the culture. I am a lifelong learner, and I continue to educate myself on the vast history of one of the most ancient peoples of the world. This will be a very long and honestly difficult story to tell, but I welcome you to join me on this journey. Stating all of that, I want to begin our journey explaining how the Ming Dynasty fell to the Qing Dynasty. Welcome to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can start, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and many other ancient cultures, so go give them a look over on YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if after all that you are still hungry for some history content, why don't you go over to my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube, where I actually cover the entire history of 19th century China and Japan. So over there, you'll find things like a full documentary on the Opium Wars, or perhaps the Taiping Rebellion, or maybe you like the Russo-Japanese War. Give it a look. It would mean a lot to me. The Ming-Qing transition is a story filled with drama and corruption, heroes and villains, traitors and martyrs, peasant rebellions, corrupt politicians, and terrifying invaders would eventually collapse what was the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was the ruling dynasty of China between 1368 and 1644. It would be the last dynasty to be ruled by Han Chinese. They had overthrown the Mongol-led Yuan Dynasty of 1271 to 1368, which fell for a plethora of reasons, such as class conflict caused by heavy taxation and ethnic conflicts. During the entire history of China, there was always room for rebellions, and quite a number of Han revolts would occur, such as the Red Turban Rebellion, beginning in 1351. Now, amongst these rebellions taking place, there was Zhu Yuanzhang, a man born into the impoverished peasant family in Jiangyi County, that being present-day Fangyang of Anhui Province. He had 7 older siblings, of which several were sold off by his parents because there was not enough food to go around. When he was 16, a severe drought ruined his family's harvest, and this was accompanied by a plague that took the lives of both of his parents and all of his siblings, save for one brother. Around this time, the Yellow River dikes had flooded, causing a widespread famine. More than 7 million people would starve as a result of the drought and the famine in central northern China. The now orphaned Zhu would dedicate his life to become a Buddhist monk at the Hangjie Monastery near Fangyang to avoid starvation, which was a common practice of the poor. Then, the monastery where he lived was destroyed by an army suppressing a rebellion. I would say enough had been enough for Zhu, because this prompted him in 1352 to join a local rebel group associated with the White Lotus Society against the Yuan Dynasty. So he began to live the life of a bandit, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, as it said. The leader of the rebel group was a man named Guo Qixing, who led an attack to capture Haozhou. Guo quickly began to see the rising star that was Zhu as his rival, but would eventually die in 1355, leaving Zhu to take leadership of the rebel army. Zhu attacked and captured towns and cities in eastern China, and as Zhu did this, he also found scholars who educated him. This allowed Zhu to learn the principles of good governance, and soon his abilities were beginning to show. This local rebel group had eventually joined the larger Red Turban Army to rebel against the Yuan Dynasty. And eventually, young Zhu rose through the ranks, and he would emerge the leader of the rebellion. Zhu early on ordered the scholars in his ranks to portray him as a national leader against the Mongols, rather than just a popular rebel. In 1356, Zhu's forces captured the strategic city of Nanjing, which would then become the future capital of the Ming Dynasty. Zhu would emerge as the national leader against the Mongols, though he had rivals such as Chen Youliang, based in Wuchang, and Zhang Zhishang, based in Pingjiang. Both rivals declared themselves leaders of new dynasties, Chen as emperor of the Han Dynasty, and Zhang as the prince of the Zhou Dynasty. Zhu managed to defeat Chen's naval forces at Lake Poyang in 1363, and Chen would die with the destruction of that very fleet. With the conquest of Chen's holdings at Wuchang, Hebei, Yunnan, and Jiangxi, Zhu soon proclaimed himself as Prince of Wu. Then Zhu was able to capture Zhang Qichang, who committed suicide. And after this, many rebel groups fell into submission. After continuing the fight against the Yuan and other warlords until 1368, Zhu proclaimed himself emperor of the new Ming Dynasty, adopting the name Hongwu, meaning vastly martial, though he is more correctly referred to as the Taizu Emperor. Emperor Hongwu sent out his armies to conquer the north, while provinces in China submitted to his rule. The northwest was the first to fall, followed by the southwest, and by 1382, unification would be complete. Under his rule, the Mongol bureaucracy that had dominated the Yuan dynasty were replaced with Han Chinese officials. He reinstituted the imperial examination, something that had roots going as far back as the Three Kingdoms period. He began major projects such as a long city wall around Ming-Qing. Now, Hongwu was a very paranoid and cruel, even irrational ruler, and this would increase as he aged. Upon taking power, he immediately transformed the palace guards into a quasi-secret police force, and he began a massive campaign to root out anyone who might threaten his authority. Hongwu sent his secret police to work, which resulted in a 14-year campaign of terror. In 1380, the Prime Minister, Zhu Yuanzhang, was found to be plotting a coup to take the throne. He would be executed alongside 30,000 or so officials. Hongwu abolished the Prime Minister and Chancellorship roles in the government. Yet this did not satisfy him, and 2 subsequent campaigns would occur, resulting in the killing of 70,000 other people, ranging from government officials all the way down to servants. Your typical new emperor stuff. Emperor Hongwu began a process of stationing members of his royal family all across the empire. He did, after all, have 26 sons. Wow! And those who survived long enough became princes, and they were assigned a territory and even a military to rule. This system he built up would have some very dire consequences further down the road. Now, just because Hongwu had overthrown the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and drove them north, this did not mean that they were gone. Zhu envisioned early into his reign a border policy where mobile armies along the northern frontier would guard against the Mongol threat. And adding to this, he wanted 8 outer garrisons near the steppe, and a system of forts and other defensive structures. The inner line of this defense would end up being the Ming Great Wall, part of the Great Wall of China we see today. Manchuria and parts of Outer Mongolia remained under the control of the Mongols, and they held what is called the Northern Yuan dynasty. They too would be conquered by Hongwu's forces, and after the emperor's death, would be complacent, though they would claim to still be the legitimate heirs to the throne. Speaking of heirs to the throne, Hongwu would eventually die, and he was succeeded by his 15-year-old grandson, Zhu Yuanzhang, who would take up the title Jianwen Emperor in 1398. Now, Hongwu had chosen Zhu Yuanzhang to succeed him, but as is common throughout history, there would always be someone else who would vie for the position. Now, following somewhat in his grandfather's footsteps, the Jianwen Emperor began his emperorship by trying to limit the power of those who could threaten him, i.e., his family. One of his first edicts he would make was for his uncles to remain in their respective territories while he simultaneously began to effectively reduce their military capabilities. The first uncle he threw proposals at held the largest territory and most powerful military. His name was Yue Ji, and he was the Prince of Yan, and he simply refused all the proposals. Then the Jianwen Emperor arrested one uncle on treason charges, stripped his family of the royal status, and exiled them. Zhu Yuan followed this up by doing the same thing to 4 more uncles. Well, as you can imagine, a rift began to emerge between the families being targeted and that of Zhu Yuan. So the Prince of Yan, Zhu Di, who was the eldest surviving uncle and had the most formidable military, he assumed leadership amongst the targeted families. This prompted Zhu Yuan to appoint several officials to go to current-day Beijing, where Zhu Di was stationed to stop his uncle from allegedly planning a coup. Zhu Di feigned being ill to elude the officials, but they reported back to the emperor they thought a coup was still about to occur. Thus the emperor gave the order to arrest his uncle at court, but an official at court leaked this information to Zhu Di. Zhu Di soon began a rebellion against his nephew, which led to a 3-year-long civil war, known as the Jingyan Rebellion. This all cultivated in the end with Zhu Di personally leading his forces to take the imperial palace in Nanjing. Allegedly, Emperor Zhu Yuan set the imperial palace on fire in his own despair. His body was never located, and it is also alleged he may have made an escape and went into exile. Zhu Di, regardless, held an imperial funeral for his nephew, and he was crowned the new Yongle Emperor, which means perpetual happiness. The reign of Emperor Yongle is considered a second founding of the Ming Dynasty because of the enormous amount of achievements made. Nanjing was demoted to a secondary capital, and now Beijing was made the official capital. Yongle began the construction of the Imperial City and the Forbidden City, employing hundreds of thousands of workers. He decided to build a treasure fleet in 1403, and from 1405 to 1433, there were 7 maritime expeditions undertaken by the Ming treasure fleet. The ambitious project resulted in the construction of up to almost 3,000 ships, and expanded the Chinese tributary system to other countries as far as India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. Seriously, an entire podcast could be dedicated to the Ming treasure voyages alone. They were incredible. Emperor Yongle would stage 5 giant military campaigns against the Mongols and Oryats north of the Great Wall, which in turn would lead to more building up of the Great Wall of China throughout the 15th century to the 16th. Emperor Yongle's efforts allowed the empire to be stable and prosperous for a century before it began to weaken. Now, after Yongle, the 6th and 8th emperor of the Ming Dynasty, Emperor Zhengdang, and yes, you heard that right, the 6th and 8th, so allow me to explain this situation. Emperor Zhengdang was encouraged by an influential court eunuch named Wang Jin to lead a force personally to face off against the Oryats of the northern Yuan dynasty, leaving his half-brother, Zhu Qiyu, in charge temporarily. The Oryats had begun a 3-pronged invasion of the Ming Dynasty. So, at the age of 21, Emperor Zhengdang personally led the Battle of Tumu Fortress against the Oryat leader, Shi. Yeah, he lost, and was one of the most humiliating battles in Chinese history. Some rather ridiculous sources state 500,000 Ming forces fell to a Oryat cavalry force of just 20,000. This is obviously an exaggeration. Shi Tong was captured by Shi, and he was held for ransom, leading to what is called the Tumu Crisis. In the meantime, his brother took the throne as the Qingtai Emperor. Zhu Tong would eventually be released in the year 1450, and he would return home, only to be put immediately under house arrest by the Qingtai Emperor for over 7 years. Now, Qingtai would be succeeded by Zhengdang's son as the Zhenghua Emperor, but Qingtai stripped him of his royal title and installed his own son as heir. But that son died, and then the Qingtai Emperor would soon follow, as the former Zhengdang Emperor led a palace coup against him. And so, the Zhongtong Emperor seized the throne and changed his regal name to Xuexue, meaning obedience to heaven. Then he demoted Jintai to the status of prince, and he ruled for around 7 years. So, yeah, that's how you become emperor twice, apparently. The Ming Dynasty was a very impressive empire and would be one of the most stable and longest ruling periods in all of Chinese history. Many enormous achievements were made by the Ming. As I've already mentioned, they built up a large part of the Great Wall of China, the Forbidden City, and led 7 massive voyages with the treasure fleet. But there was much, much more. They created woodblock color printing and China's first metal movable type printing, which was created by the Ming scholar Hua Sui in 1490. The first book printed using the technique was Zhu Yuanzhang. Alongside that, the most comprehensible medical book ever written by Li Shijian in 1578 about traditional Chinese medicine, Compendium of Materia Medica. In Chinese, it is called Bianqiao Gangmu. And another book was published during the Ming period, which was called in English Journey to the West in 1592 by Wu Chang'an, and is considered one of the 4 greatest classical novels of Chinese literature. That book built upon the accounts of the pilgrimage of the Tang Dynasty's Buddhist monk, Zhu Yuanzhang, who traveled to Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent searching for sutras. The economy of the Ming Dynasty was the largest in the world, following in the steps of the Han and Song periods to become known as one of China's 3 golden ages. With a massive agricultural surplus, porcelain goods and silk led to silver pouring into China. Speaking of porcelain, it was one of the most loved exports of the Ming, as they had perfected the technique built up during the Tang Dynasty. The blue and white porcelain became extremely popular in Europe. And speaking about Europe, while the Ming made such incredible achievements, one departure they did less well in seems to be in terms of scientific discovery. The Ming Dynasty was categorized to be generally conservative and very inward-looking. It's hard to blame them, though. They were basically one of the, if not pillars of the world. The West and East were not as isolated as one would think, and the Ming by no means opened any relatively new relations with the West. For example, there is evidence to support that Roman merchants during the reign of Marcus Aurelius had ventured as far as the Han capital city of Luoyang. Yet, it would only be much later in history when one particular group made some waves in the Ming Dynasty, and that would be the Portuguese in the 16th century. The first to land on Linton Island in May of 1513 was the Portuguese explorer Jorge Alves, which was one of the first times Europeans made contact with China via the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope. Then in 1516, the cousin of the famous Christopher Columbus, one Rafael Perestrello, became the first known European explorer to land by sea and trade in Guangzhou. The Portuguese would follow this up by attempting an inland delegation in the name of Manuel I of Portugal to the court of the Zhengjue Emperor. Unfortunately for them, the Zhengjue Emperor would die in 1521 as they awaited an audience, and they would end up being quasi-blamed for the emperor's death, and would all be imprisoned for life. Rather hilariously, one Simão de Andrade, the brother to the ambassador sent as a delegation, began to rile up the Chinese belief that the Portuguese were trying to kidnap Chinese children and allegedly cook and eat them. There had been speculations this was all based on the idea Simão was purchasing or kidnapping Chinese children to take them as slaves. Well, one thing led to another, and the Ming Dynasty found itself enveloped in a small naval battle with the Portuguese naval force of Diogo Calvião in 1521. The naval battle of Tunmen was the result of the Portuguese sailing up the river to Guangzhou without permission. Allegedly, the Portuguese gave a cannon salute when they reached Guangzhou, and this friendly gesture was quite alarming to the locals. I would imagine as to why. Well, while things were pretty cool for a bit, then the delegation situation had gone sour, and this led to an edict being made to evict the Portuguese, and the Portuguese, well, they didn't like that. Now, the Portuguese cannons had superior range, but they were easily surrounded by a horde of ships, and the 5 caravels were forced to use some bad weather to their advantage to flee the scene. By the way, that slave purchasing / child kidnapper Simoa continued for decades to do business in Jiaomen and Ningbo. Eventually, he ran into some trouble when he did, well, what he does best, steal children, and the locals band together to slaughter him, and those working for him. Despite this, let's call it a minor setback, the Portuguese continued to do some limited trade along the Fujian coastline, with the help of some rather corrupt local Ming merchants. By 1529, the Portuguese were sending annual trade missions to Shangchuan Island, and by the 1550s, the Portuguese established firmer feet in Macau, where they established a trade colony. The Portuguese even began to help the Chinese fight off hundreds of pirate ships running havoc in the area. They then followed this up by fighting off the Dutch later in the 17th century. This all, of course, would not stop the great Dutch maritime empire from eventually taking over, though the Portuguese found a very lucrative business in becoming middlemen when the Japanese were banned from trade with China. The Portuguese, you see, they would take Chinese silk, hawk it for some Japanese silver, and presto, it was pretty good hustle. Things were looking good for the Ming Dynasty, but troubles loomed around every corner. One of those corners we hinted at just a bit. That was the Japanese. Japan had stopped sending tribute missions to China in 838 when it was the Tang Dynasty. 6 centuries later, between 1403 and 1547, the Ming Dynasty was quite powerful, and the Japanese shogunate was relatively weak. The founder of the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, demanded Japan resume its tributary relationship with China if Japan wanted to trade with China. Japan agreed to recommence the tributary relationship with China, believing that the trade would be beneficial and that China's recognition of the shogun as a partner would help strengthen the shogunate. Thus, the tributary relationship continued as of 1403, and it would be almost a century until Japan abandoned it again. Speaking of Japan, by 1590, Japan's warring states struggled to an end when Toyotomi Hideyoshi emerged victorious and unified the nation. Yet, soon the ailing leader of Japan, for a platitude of reasons, decided to try and invade the Ming Dynasty. But to do so, he would need to go through Korea. Historians argue one of the main reasons for the invasion of Korea was so Hideyoshi could keep his troops occupied, as he may have feared them returning home would result in another domestic conflict. Hideyoshi did not study his enemy, nor the territory his forces would be fighting upon. It also really seemed Hideyoshi was in a fit of egomania after unifying Japan and became convinced he was able to conquer the Ming Dynasty. Now, I can't go too much into what is collectively known as the Imjian War of 1592 to 1598, but if you are interested, you can go check out Kings and Generals over at YouTube, where they have a few episodes on the event, including Imjian War, beginning of the Japanese invasion of Korea, Imjian War, Rise of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, and the Noryang Straits 1598 episode. They're all amazing. Go watch them, you'll like them. But what you need to know is that Hideyoshi asked, or rather ordered, the Joseon dynasty to allow his forces safe passage to go and invade their allies, and protector, the Ming Dynasty. The Koreans gave a prompt no, but this did not stop Hideyoshi from transporting around 160,000 warriors to Pusan with the intention of marching them through Korea, then Manchuria, and straight on towards Beijing. This all would see Japan invading and fighting against the Zhou Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty forces in 2 separate campaigns. Now, initially, the war went quite well for the Japanese. The Koreans were not prepared, and a few thousand Chinese troops dispatched to help them got absolutely stomped around the Yalu River. Well, the Ming Emperor Wang Yi, surprised by the failure of his forces, decided to toss a much larger number of men, very much to the shock of the Japanese. The combined forces of the Ming and Joseon dynasty managed to push the Japanese out of the Korean peninsula. A cool fact, by the way, about this war was how the Koreans designed these armored warships known as turtle ships, which held a ton of firepower for the time. The turtle ships under the command of Admiral Yi Sun-sin had outmaneuvered the Japanese ships and decimated them, thus thwarting the Japanese from sending any more troop ships over to Korea. In the end, the Ming Dynasty had quelled the Japanese challenge at their status as the supreme military power in East Asia, and also affirmed that the Ming were willing to protect their tributary states, like the Joseon Dynasty. The Japanese, by some estimates, lost a third of their troops during the first year of the war. The cost of the war came at a steep price. It is estimated around 250 to 300,000 people died, perhaps 100,000 Japanese, 185,000 Koreans, and 29,000 Chinese. And while that is truly a horrifying number, the monetary costs were also quite steep. Estimates put it in the range of up to 26 million ounces of silver for the Ming Dynasty. Overall, the war was a lose-lose situation for Japan, China, and Korea. Yet it seems this war had a side effect that would prove to be one of the many nails that would be smashed into what becomes the Ming Dynasty's coffin. For while this venture played out down in south of Korea, its effects rippled all the way back up to the Ming Dynasty's northern realm. During this time period, there were 3 major Jurchen tribes. I will just point out, I am aware that the Chinese call them more along the lines of Nurhaci, but for the sakes of myself being an English speaker and many people knowing them by the English name, I will refer to them as Jurchen. The Jurchen lived in the northern part of Manchuria. There was the Haixi Jurchens who lived along the Haixi River, and the Qianzhou Jurchens who lived along the Mudan River in the region of Shangbaixian. Jurchen, by the way, is something like a collective name for these people. Their ancestors went by another name, the Manchu. They were a semi-nomadic people and heavily influenced by their neighbors, the Mongols. A Jianzhou Jurchen named Nurhaci had lost both his father, Taxi, and grandfather, Jiokanga, when a rival Jurchen chieftain named Nikan Wailan attacked them at the Gur in 1582. Nurhaci demanded that the Ming hand over Nikan Wailan to him for execution, but they refused and went as far as considering to declare Nikan Wailan as the new Khan of all the Jurchens, believing this would keep them all divided. It goes without saying, Nikan Wailan's forces were being supported by the Ming. The Ming were utilizing the same strategy they had been doing since ancient times to deal with the peoples of the steppe: foster rivalries amongst the tribes and keep them disunified. It is said Nurhaci was a gifted mounted archer from youth. He could speak multiple languages and loved to read Chinese literature such as Shuihu Chuan, meaning water margin, and Xiangui Yanyi, which means romance of the 3 kingdoms. At the age of 25, Nurhaci avenged his father and grandfather's deaths by defeating Nikan Wailan in battle in 1587, sending him fleeing to the Ming for protection. The Ming would eventually execute him years later, but this would not satisfy Nurhaci. In 1589, the Ming Dynasty appointed Nurhaci as the paramount chieftain of the Yalu region. It seems the Ming Dynasty believed that Nurhaci's tribe was too weak to unify the other tribes and become a threat to them, thus fulfilling their strategy of keeping them disunified. Then, Nurhaci managed to defeat a coalition of over 9 rival tribes, one of which was the Yehua tribe during the Battle of Gur. In 1591, Nurhaci had consolidated a large swath of territory stretching from Fushun to the Yalu River, and this provoked the Yehe tribes, who had sent a force of over 30,000 against him. Nurhaci's men were able to turn back the Yehe menace, and while Nurhaci continued to rally tribes under his command, the Imjin War began. As the Japanese were invading Korea, the rising Jurchen leader had some limited engagements against the Japanese along the border of Korea and Manchuria. This led Nurhaci to offer assistance to the Ming and Joseon dynasties for the Imjin War effort, but both the Ming and the Joseon dynasties would refuse this offer, especially the Joseon dynasty, who stated, quote, "To accept such assistance from northern barbarians would be disgraceful." End of quote. Now, the Imjin War indirectly weakened the Ming dynasty's position in Manchuria and gave the now rather insulted Jurchen leader Nurhaci an opportunity to expand his influence and territory. Nurhaci began to conquer and consolidate the unrelated tribes surrounding Manchuria. In 1599, Nurhaci had his trusted scholar Erdani create a system of writing using the traditional Mongolian alphabet that laid out the foundation of what would become the Manchu alphabet. The Manchu as a people, by the way, are really hard to define and have been referred to sometimes as simply Jurchens or Tartars, given who is speaking about them and really what time period it is. In reality, the Manchu is a rather broad umbrella term for a few different groups of people in a large area of Manchuria, and the term Manchu was chosen specifically to create a sort of legitimate ancestry by those who eventually would bear its name. In 1601, Nurhaci began to develop the Manchu military, which became the banner system later, as seen in the Qing dynasty. The banners derived from the Yiwu, meaning arrow, a designation for a small Jurchen hunting band. This led to the organization of cavalry and infantry companies of around 300 men with subdivisions of 75. These units eventually evolved into differing banners, yellow, white, red, and blue at first. Then this increased to a total of 8 later on. If you have never seen the 8-banner army uniforms from the late Qing dynasty, I highly recommend Googling it. They're absolutely awesome to see, unique colors for the armor and everything. When I was beginning my personal channel on YouTube, the Pacific War channel by the way, I had to do an episode on the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, where I came across the 8-banner army, and I have to say, it left an impression on me. They're a very interesting military formation, although by that time they were actually quite ineffective, and thus, well, the Qing dynasty would have to kind of get rid of them. Now, the banner system was not a purely military thing. It also became the established social hierarchy for what was to become a new state. It's important to note, during this unifying effort, Nurhaci had also acquired a vast amount of Han Chinese defectors, and with them, Ming knowledge and technology, such as firearms. A lot of these Han Chinese would be married to Manchu women to form marriage alliances. The idea behind this was to take the tribe system and use it as a kind of building block for a military bureaucracy. This in turn also acted as a method of creating an administrative structure of the future Manchu people. Nurhaci built up his new empire's economy via mining and trade, and managed to accumulate a lot of silver from tributary missions to the Ming Dynasty. In 1607, Nurhaci declared himself Kandolun Khan over what he proclaimed to be the Qin state, named after the former Jurchen-led Great Qin Dynasty. Now all of this was done to assert some kind of divine lineage to the Qin Dynasty of the 12th century, and in some ways was an implied challenge towards the Ming Dynasty. Indeed, Nurhaci even began to publicly refer to the Ming Dynasty as merely the Southern Dynasty, implying equality with his new state. So it seems the Ming Dynasty had greatly miscalculated Nurhaci, and now they had quite a threat bearing down upon them. In 1610, Nurhaci broke relations with the Ming imperial court, and in 1618 he demanded they pay him tribute. and sent them what is legendarily known as the 7 Grievances. This was a list of 7 terrible acts the Ming Dynasty had performed against Nurhaci personally and that of the Manchu people. Basically, a highlight reel of everything they did to try and stop the tribes from unifying. Smack dab as number 1, by the way, was supporting the man who killed Nurhaci's father and grandfather. The 7 Grievances also acted as a formal declaration of war against the Ming Dynasty. To think, one day you're financing the murder of some small tribal leaders. The next thing you know, their offspring has raised a new national people to take you out. A confederacy of Jurchen tribes referred to as the Hulun tribes gradually began to recognize Nurhaci's authority, but some took more time to convince, so to say. The Jurchen tribes of Hada, Hoifa, and Ula were all defeated and assimilated by 1613, but then there remained one last Jurchen tribe that would not submit, and it was, well, one of the most formidable, the Yihi. In 1618, the Yihi leader, Nurhaci, united with the Ming Dynasty to combat the newly emerged threat that was Nurhaci. As it would turn out, the flashpoint for the conflict that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Ming Dynasty would occur at a frontier town in the northeast. The town held one of the 18 key fortresses established by the founder of the Ming Dynasty, Emperor Hongwu. The first official battle with the Ming Dynasty would occur at Fushuan. Fushuan was located on the Han River just east of Shenyang. Nurhaci sent a letter to the Yihi at Fushuan stating, quote, "If there is a battle, then the arrows shot by our soldiers will strike all in sight. If you are hit, you will surely die. Your strength cannot withstand. Even though you die in battle, there is no profit. If you come out and surrender, our soldiers will not enter the city. The soldiers attached to you will be given complete protection. But suppose our soldiers do attack and enter. The old and young inside the city will surely be in jeopardy. Your official salaries will be taken away and your ranks will soon be reduced. If you submit without fighting, I will not change your great dodo at all. I will let you live just as you did before. I will promote not only the people with great knowledge and foresight, but also many other people. Give them daughters in marriage and care for them. I will give you a higher position than you have and treat you like one of my officials of the first degree." End of quote. In addition to being the first official military challenge to the Ming authority, Fushuan was connected to Nurhaci's strategy of assimilating the remaining rival Jurchen tribes, such as the Haixi. Fushuan also happened to be quite isolated and not as well protected as the other great fortress cities. Commanding the defenses of Fushuan was Li Yongfang, who had around 1,200 men under him. Nurhaci would throw 20,000 men at the city. But before he did this, he sent around 50 men disguised as horse traders into the city. These 50 infiltrators opened the gates to Nurhaci's men, who soon poured in. Li Yongfang was horrified by the scene, as several of his subordinates rushed to give their lives, facing the invaders. Li Yongfang was captured and brought before Nurhaci, who said to him, "I know you are a man of many talents and have had many experiences, and my state is in search of such talent, as we are lacking in capable officials and are looking to employ capable generals. What purpose will your death serve? But if you surrender, you and all your soldiers will be safe." End of quote. Li Yongfang agreed to surrender if the people would be spared. Nurhaci honored this promise, and in the end, around 590 Ming soldiers died during the attack. Li Yongfang soon became a general under Nurhaci and even married one of his granddaughters. Li Yongfang became the first prominent Ming commander to defect, and this would set a precedent for many, many more. A large reason Ming officials like Li Yongfang defected was because they were not going to be forced to give up their culture or customs. After capturing the fortress of Foshuan, Nurhaci left 4,000 men to guard it and now turned his attention to another fortress in Qinghengjiang, or known simply as Qinghe. The outraged Ming court did not waste any time sending a counterattack to take back Foshan. The Ming dispatched Commander Jiang Chengyin with around 10,000 men to recapture the city. Jiang and his men besieged the city, digging trenches and raining hell upon its walls using cannon and firearms. Nurhaci's sons, Huang Taiji and Daishan, took the force of 4,000 men outside the city and, to the shock of the besiegers, charged directly upon them. It is estimated only 20% of the Ming force survived this devastating attack, and the rest fled or were captured. The Ming court was stunned by the loss of Foshan and knew it was not the only fortress that would be attacked. Thus, they dispatched an expeditionary force of 5,000 men with two commanders, Li Rubai, the commander of Liaodong, and Yang Hao, the military affairs commissioner, to support the region, beginning with Qinghe. Both men were personally liked by Emperor Wang Yi, but both also had undergone scandals during the Imjian War, when they messed up during a siege battle. With the new reinforcements brought over by the two commanders, Qinghe now had a garrison of 6,400 strong. Before leaving to help other areas, Yang Hao advised the commander of the Qinghe fortress, Zhe Chusen, that he should lay an ambush out for the invaders, perhaps in the mountain pass nearby, where they could take advantage of Ming firearms. Zhou did not heed this and opted instead to remain within the fortress. The reinforcing of the Qinghe fortress would prove to be fruitless. The defenders fired their cannons, hurled large boulders and logs, and tossed hot oil, inflicting heavy casualties upon Nurhaci's men. But despite all of that, the besiegers were quick to take a corner wall, as the defenders were too busy loading up their cannons. The siege quickly turned into bloody street-to-street fighting, and with it, the complete slaughter of the city's forces. Zhou and his subordinates perished alongside most within the city. This prompted the Ming court to place a price over Nurhaci's head, 10,000 taels of silver. It is apparent the Ming were not prepared to face the challenge pressed upon them by somebody like Nurhaci. They had failed to anticipate Nurhaci's state-building efforts, and now the fruits of his labor were bearing witness. With the fall of Qinghe and the surrounding towns, the Ming court now dispatched an even larger force of 100,000 men to attack Nurhaci's forces. Yang Hua formulated the strategy for the grand operation. They would divide into 4 groups of around 30,000 men each and approach Nurhaci's stronghold of Hetuela from 4 different directions and surround it. Ma Lin would lead the northern group coming from Keiyuan, Du Song from the west coming from Foshan, Li Rubo would come from the southwest through the Yao Pass. Last, Liao Ting, also known as Big Sword Liu, would come from the southeast from Quanjian, supported by 13,000 strong Zhou Dynasty expeditionary forces, commanded by Gang Honglip. Despite all of the planning, Yang Hao did not believe their forces had adequate training nor the supplies for the venture. It is estimated that Nurhaci had around 60,000 men at this time. Nurhaci had also been using amazing scouts that provided him with great intelligence of the Ming plans, and he decided the best course of action was to concentrate all of his forces together and pick off each Ming group one by one. Thus, he sent small detachments of around 500 men each to intercept Liao Qing, Ma Lin, and Li Rubo to misdirect them, while he would take the main force to smash Du Song, whom he deemed the greatest threat out of the 4 groups. To beat Du Song, Nurhaci snuck 15,000 of his men into the forested mountains near Sarhe for an ambush. Dusong's force of around 30,000 men set forth from Foshan, which they had recently recaptured with ease as it was left undefended. Dusong was frustrated by this, and he wanted to face the enemy, and he finally found them when he came across the Han River and saw a Jin force on the other side. Dusong took 10,000 of his men to cross the river and attack, so that a beachhead could be formed, and thus provided adequate room for a safe transfer of the rest of his forces and equipment. So, he left behind the other 20,000 men with all the war equipment who would follow them once the Jin force was pushed back. When Dusong's men were halfway across the river, Nurhaci sprung a trap. It turns out Nurhaci had ordered his forces to prepare the breaking of some dams, and at that very moment, Dusong's 10,000 men got halfway in to the river, and that's when they broke them. The Ming forces in disarray had to flee back from the raging water, abandoning a ton of their equipment. Now Dusong's force had to go from the offensive to the defensive, erecting 2 camps on the opposite side of the river quite frantically. Those troops Nurhaci snuck in the forested mountains then came down upon the camp that held Dusong, and Nurhaci himself personally led 6 banners to attack the camp as well. Nurhaci's forces, much like Genghis Khan, came in with horsebacked archers to pelt the defenders. The Ming musketeers divided themselves into 2 to 3 rows, taking their turns to fire and reload their guns. This is known as repeated fire. Basically, it's a more rustic version of what you see during something like the Revolutionary Wars for America. Some of these guns, by the way, are known as 追风枪, wind-chasing guns. They're around 5 feet long and shot fairly large lead bullets. With one of these, you can probably hit something within 40 feet away pretty effectively. So, you must be thinking, well, the Ming musketeers must have shot the Qin cavalry up like a turkey shoot. But you would be wrong. Interesting little side note here. The bow and arrow historically has always trumped firearms, honestly, until the invention of the repeating rifle or revolver. If you know something about Aboriginal history, like the wars in America, it was the innovation of the repeating rifle and the revolver that finally allowed the American militaries to defeat peoples like the Comanche. Until those were invented, horseback archers were able to get off far too many shots by the time people with firearms could shoot and reload. And that's basically what happened here. Nurhaci's horseback archers pelted the Ming musketeers and began flanking them until, well, they broke formation and fled. After this, Nurhaci besieged the other camp at Jilin Cliff, and soon the Jin force had surrounded them there, and Dusong alongside 2 other generals were killed during what was a slaughter. It was said that corpses piled up like a mountain, and the fields were drenched in blood. End of quote. Upon hearing that Nurhaci had annihilated the force under Dusong, the inbound force led by Ma Lin, coming from a northern position, chose to be much more cautious. Ma Lin and his 30,000 men soon found the fleeing remnants of Dusong's force and quickly incorporated them into his own. He then formed 3 camps at Zhangjiayan and fortified them with trenches and cannons. Nurhaci sent 1,000 men to prod the defenses of the main camp that held Ma Lin's command, and he also drew out his attention. The 1,000 men dismounted and moved forward cautiously, drawing the Ming gunfire their way. Once Nurhaci had a good idea of the layout of their defenses, he sent in a joint infantry-cavalry assault to make a swift attack upon the weakest point of Ma Lin's camp. The Ming musketeers could barely get off more than a single volley before the Jin horse-riding warriors descended upon them. The front lines were being cut to pieces, and soon the entire army's morale broke and several men were routed. Commander Ma Lin barely escaped with his life, and many of his officers died in a nearby river, turning it, as sources say, crimson with their blood. The 2 other camps fell in a similar fashion. Thus, Nurhaci had just annihilated 2 out of the incoming 4 armies and took some 4,000 of his forces back to Hutuala to recuperate their strength. Yang Hao saw the absolute mayhem occurring and ordered the remaining forces to retreat and regroup. But the force coming in from the east, led by Big Sword Liao Ting, never got those orders. Now, unlike his other colleagues, Liao Ting was actually having some success against the Qin expeditionary parties. The 13,000 Chosun expeditionary force was with Liao Ting, consisting of 10,000 musketeers and 3,000 archers. They were proving themselves to be very capable warriors. He managed to capture a few fortresses, killed 2 Qin generals, and inflicted a few thousand casualties. Nurhaci then decided to do something rather cunning. He slipped some saboteurs into Liao Ting's army. These saboteurs pretended to be messengers from Du Song, stating that his force was already besieging Hutuala and desperately needed assistance for the final victory. Liao Ting proceeded to respond by increasing his army's speed to rush to Hutuala. Because of this increased speed they were going at, Liao Ting's force became very stretched out, and now there were practically 2 divided groups. At around 18 miles from Hutuala, Liao Ting's frontal force was ambushed in the Abu Dali Pass, and this allowed 2 of Nurhaci's sons, Dai Xian and Hong Zaiji, to both make cavalry charges, one after the other, into the front of Liao Ting's force. These back-to-back charges inflicted heavy casualties, and they soon managed to surround the Ming force, exacting an estimated 10,000 casualties upon them. It is also said that Liao Ting himself went down, killing several Qin with him. He must have been waving around a pretty big sword. By the way, I tried quite hard to find out how his nickname came about, and I failed to find anything concrete, so if anyone actually knows, I would love to hear about it. Why don't you comment on one of my YouTube videos? Why was his nickname Big Sword? The Korean musketeers performed quite well, but the archers, it is alleged, fired without arrowheads. Because the Joseon dynasty intended to keep a stance of neutrality with the newly emerged Qin people, the Joseon musketeers were eventually overwhelmed by the Jin cavalry because they lacked spearmen in their formations to thwart off the charges, something they would improve upon later down the road. Gang Hongrip ended up surrendering the remaining 4,500 of his forces. Those who survived later captivity were eventually allowed to return to their homeland. Gang Hongrip was proficient in the Jurchen language, and he was held as a hostage for quite a while. Interestingly, once the battle was won and done, Nurhaci went back to Hutuala to celebrate, and one of the first things he did afterwards was send a message to the king of the Joseon dynasty, asking why they sent an expeditionary force to aid the Mings. The king tried to play it cool and sent a letter of congratulations for the victory, but made sure not to write anything that recognized the Qin state. It seemed the Joseon dynasty was now stuck between the Ming-Qing conflict, and this would hold dire consequences later. Li Rubo had received the message to retreat from Yang Hao, so he was able to avoid disaster, losing around 1,000 troops before getting out to safety. Overall, it is estimated that the Ming lost some 45,000 troops, 28,000 horses, and a ton of war equipment. The Jin claimed to have lost only 200 men, but better estimations put that around 5,000 perhaps. The Ming court was rocked by this loss and ordered the arrest for Yang Hao, sending the embroidered uniform guard after him. Those were essentially the emperor's secret police. Li Rubo was impeached because there were rumors going around that he had only survived because he had a personal relationship with Nurhaci. Li Rubo would commit suicide before his trial, and Yang Hao would rot in prison for almost a decade before being executed. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if after all that you are still hungry for some Chinese history, why don't you go over to YouTube and check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, where I have content covering the First and Second Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, and much more. Give it a look, you'll like it. Nurhaci did not stop after defeating the four armies. He continued to raise hell by capturing Kaiyuan, Jieling, and Zijiang without breaking much of a sweat. Hell, Nurhaci was said to have braved a hail of arrows when he personally led the assault on the east wall of Zijiang. Over in Chahar, some of Nurhaci's subjects were defeated at Guangning, and this would lead to ongoing troubles between the Jin and Chahar Mongols for 15 years. Now Zijiang was the last bastion of Nurhaci's Yehe Jurchen rivals. So now, he looked towards more empire-building activities. Alongside with his advisors, they began to plan the conquest of Shenyang, and perhaps establish the new Jin capital in its place.